Uvalde, Buffalo, Highland Park. It's rather unexpected, or is it, to add that last city to the list of mass shootings that have just happened in the last few months. Sometimes we say that things hit close to home. This week it hit home, literally. Jeff Prass lives just a few blocks from there and was out with his kids close to the shooting during that 4th of July parade. Rebecca Rouse, sitting here in the sanctuary, has just moved to Highland Park because it's a nice, quiet place to live, right, Rebecca? There's an epidemic of gun violence in our country, and it can hit anywhere. And these days, I feel like the question is not if, but when. I grew up in Highland Park. To grade school, middle school, started high school there. On Wednesday, Cantor Kotler and I went up to Highland Park High School to offer pastoral care for people. The FBI set up a center there for people to get counseling, to pick up their belongings, to be interviewed by the FBI if there was anything that they had seen or experienced. We arrived Wednesday at noon just as they were getting set up and putting things in place, and we walked into the high school. And one of the first people I bumped into, somebody I knew, who I worked with 30 years ago. Later that day, I bumped into someone else I knew because this is the community I grew up in. Cantor Kotler and I listened to the people's stories as they are waiting to talk to the FBI or waiting to find hats, strollers. Stories we heard were horrific. The first woman I talked to was a grandmother, was there with her grandkids, and she said, "I'm here to pick up their hat and their headband. My daughter says it's crazy. Why should I be coming here? I don't need those things." She said, "It's not about the things. It just somehow, I felt like having had to run from the scene and that this was a bit of normalcy just to pick up our things again. It's not about the things. It's about my heart." And another couple I spoke to was there with their grown daughter, a couple probably in their 70s. The man had shrapnel in his calf because these high-powered rifles, the bullets don't just go in straight, they shatter. They gave him antibiotics and told him to go home, that they can't take out the shrapnel. It just stays in you. Their daughter, who wasn't with them at the parade, who was sitting there, a woman in her 30s, couldn't even look me in the eye. She was so shell-shocked. She was even more disturbed than her parents were at that moment. And then I got sent upstairs and was asked to bring people downstairs to accompany them from the counseling center downstairs where the FBI was talking to people. And I met a woman about my age and her son. It's my daughter's age. He was a graduate of Highland Park High School, knew the shooter. They had been standing near a woman who was shot in the head. They grabbed her, put her into their car, and drove off to Highland Park Hospital. They were the first car to arrive. The woman was saved. Her husband died. These are just some of the stories, just personally, that we heard in Highland Park. And then I was in touch with a classmate of mine from high school, and he said, "Andrea, the father of the shooter was a classmate of ours." Judaism supports the right for us to defend ourselves. And if somebody's coming after us, we might need to use a weapon, or we might need to use other means, but it says this about weapons so that we are careful about how we might use them. The Talmud teaches weapons are not adornments, they are only ugly. And yet, In many parts of this country, there's an obsession with guns. It's almost idolatrous. There are 400 million guns in this country, and there are only 330 million people. Rabbi Menachem Creditor, who wrote that beautiful song about building a world of love, Olam Chesed Yibaneh, has also edited a collection of essays about the imperative to curb gun violence in our country. And he says this about guns. This is at best dangerous excess, the worship of a weapon over the well-being of the collective. More accurately, this colossal amount of available guns is an invitation to widespread societal violence, however unintended. But yet gun supporters claim guns aren't the problem, mental health is. I'm all for supporting mental health services and think we should be doing a better job of that in our country, but without guns there would be much less violence. And 54% of gun deaths are suicides. I've yet to see the good guy with a gun scenario actually work. Have you? There were police swarming this parade. It took 2 minutes to kill 7 people and wound dozens more. 83 spent shell casings were found on the site. 2 minutes. The police, they couldn't do anything in those 2 minutes. He had positioned himself on a roof. Somebody I know posted a meme on his Facebook page about the accused shooter entering the Highland Park Synagogue on Passover. There's a Chabad synagogue just west of where the shooting took place on Central. The guard looked at him, thought he looked a little suspicious, talked to him. He walked around for a little while because he was clearly not there to pray, and then he left. But this acquaintance of mine said because the guard had a gun and some congregants were carrying weapons in the sanctuary that day, it was proof that guns protect us. I don't understand how this is any kind of proof that guns protect us. The shooter didn't have a gun at the time. If he had taken it out, would those other guns have protected anybody at that moment? Let's recall 7 years ago at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida, 50 people were shot and killed. And you know who the first person to die was? The armed guard sitting at the entrance. So much for the good guy with the gun. I've yet to hear an example in which that good guy with the gun could actually do anything. Mass shootings plague our nation twice daily since the beginning of 2022. Did you hear that? Twice daily. And there's so many other gun deaths besides the mass shootings, and they fly under the radar because they're people of color, people who don't have a lot of money, because of domestic disputes. So many people are killed because of gun violence in our country. So what can we do about it? Well, we've heard about these red flag laws, and they can be critical tools in lowering the number of suicides. But as we saw in this particular case, there's many loopholes and it's hard to get them implemented. The red flag laws allow a judge to take away a firearm from someone based on the suspicion that the owner could use it to harm themselves or others. Family members, police, or doctors have to petition the court to take away the firearm, and that action can result in police removing it for up to a year. The Illinois law has been on the books since 2018, while the new gun safety measure approved by Congress last month, it was the most sweeping gun control legislation passed by Congress in nearly 3 decades and was focused on red flag laws, allocating millions to help states administer the laws. But we need to enforce the laws. The man arrested, accused of committing this crime, was able to legally buy a gun despite 2 encounters with the police in 2019, and in one encounter he had attempted to commit suicide. You got to actually apply the laws if they're on the books. Number two, we could try an assault weapon ban. Many gun control advocates say the best way to really reduce mass shootings would be for the government to reimpose an assault weapons ban or impose controls on large capacity magazines and ammunition. A federal assault weapon ban that was in place was highly effective in reducing public mass shootings, reports a new Northwestern medicine study. The study found the federal assault weapons ban that included a ban on large capacity magazines, limiting the number and caliber of bullets from 1994 to 2004, resulted in a significant decrease in public mass shootings, number of gun deaths, and number of gun injuries. And now you're looking at me and saying, well, Rabbi, if this was working between 1994 and 2004, why is it no longer in place? Well, there was a sunset clause put on that law. It was needed in order to get the bill passed because there's such a strong gun lobby in this country. And that the studies show that gun deaths decreased by 40% because of this ban. Some people have approached me and said, well, Rabbi, if we can't get rid of the guns and there's so many guns already out there, why don't we try to put restrictions on the manufacture of bullets? If these destructive bullets aren't there, people can't be injured, even if they have the weapons. The Biden administration is currently considering restricting the manufacturing and commercial sale of ammunition, so it's being considered now. But this is the response from a gun nut website that I found, and I'm going to call it that. I went and Googled, and it's amazing the kinds of things that come up. It's very scary. And this is what they say on this gun supporters website. This action of the Biden administration trying to restrict the manufacture and commercial sale of ammunition would immediately jeopardize roughly 400 to 500 jobs and wipe out more than a quarter of a certain kind of ammunition that's available to consumers that's used in these assault rifles. And then I quote, "This policy to deny the sale of excess ammunition would not only freeze over 30% of the 5.56 millimeter 223 caliber ammunition used by law-abiding gun owners, it risks the ammunition industry's ability to surge production capacity for national defense if the costs to maintain the present workforce isn't recouped through sales to the civilian market." This is their support for this. I can't say what's needed for the military market, but my hunch is that if they were only manufacturing for the military, they could probably make fewer bullets. But yet we're held hostage by the big business of guns. We're going to lose jobs. The gun manufacturers, the bullet manufacturers aren't going to make enough money. These are the kinds of jobs people have to have in our country. Shame on us. And what about the hate websites? People have been asking the question this week, was the shooter anti-Semitic? He cased a synagogue after all. It has certainly been shown that he participated in websites and chat rooms that promote white supremacy. White supremacy in all its abhorrent forms, racism, anti-Semitism, anti-immigrant sentiment, all of that comes together. Is it anti-Semitism, or is it racism, or it's all of it? It's hate. They're all connected. Anti-Semitism animates racism, and these hate websites don't make a distinction. And they get people to kill by inuring people to violence and glorifying death. We've always had hate groups in this country, but the ability to reach disaffected people is much greater now because of the internet. I don't have an answer to this, and I know a lot of people track this, but we have to understand that this is what's out there and attracting people and preparing people for violence. Today, I think that many of you probably heard that Shinzo Abe, the former Prime Minister of Japan, was assassinated. This was completely shocking in Japan. Why is that? Japan's National Police Agency reported 10 gun incidents last year, resulting in 4 injuries and 1 death. 4 injuries and 1 death in Japan because of gun violence. In the United States, on the other hand, there were 19,384 homicides by firearms in 2020, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and that doesn't include the suicides, which are 54% of gun deaths. What does Japan do? What could we learn from Japan? I found that there's a 13-step process to buying a gun in Japan. I'll just read you some of them. Number 1, join a hunting or shooting club. Number 2, take a firearm class and pass a written exam, which is held up to 3 times a year. Number 3, get a doctor's note saying you are mentally fit and do not have a history of drug abuse. Number 4, apply for a permit to take firing training, which may take up to a month. Describe in a police interview why you need a gun. Pass a review of your criminal history, gun possession record, employment, involvement with organized crime groups, personal debt and relationships with friends, family, and neighbors. And on and on and on. And yet, a mentally unstable young man who visits hate websites, has threatened people, and has threatened to commit suicide, can have a father sign over that he can get a gun. 21-year-old man, his frontal lobe isn't even fully developed until 26, and we know that. It's outrageous when people say there's nothing we can do. In our parsha today, in addition to the red heifer that I spoke about earlier, we read towards the beginning of the parsha about the death of Miriam. Later on in the parsha, Aaron also dies. And Moses hits the rock and he's told he won't enter the land of Israel. So in one fell swoop in this week's Torah portion, we're told that Miriam, Aaron, and Moses are not going to enter the land. 2 will die. 1 will die just a little bit later. Can you imagine how the Israelites must have felt at this moment? They could have been stymied and refused to continue their journey and say, forget it, our leadership is gone, we can't continue. But they don't. They continue on. They go from Kadesh to Mount Hor. They go from Mount Hor by the Sea of Reeds to skirt the land of Edom, the eastern side of the Jordan. They camp at Novot, and then Wadi, Zered, Be'er, Heshbon, Bashan. We read about all these places they journey to in this week's Torah portion, until finally they arrive in the steppes of Moab across the Jordan from Jericho. There's a lot of frustration in making progress on the gun control issue, but we can't refuse to continue to press on. Our life depends on it. We can't stand idly by the blood of our neighbors or ourselves. We have to continue to press on, even though it's so difficult in this country, and the Second Amendment makes us feel like we'll never be able to get further. There's so much rage, fear, sadness. We can feel despondent, but we need to move on. We need to continue to work on this, because our lives literally depend on it. But how do we move on? Well, the Torah tells us there's a difference between what happens after Miriam dies and after Aaron dies. After Miriam dies, it says that there is no water for the people, because Miriam was known to have carried a well of water for the people in the wilderness. And they complain and they cry and they go to Moses, and Moses goes to God, and God says to Moses, well, if you talk to this nice rock over here, water will come forth. And Moses doesn't. He picks up his staff and he hits the rock, which is why he's told he's not going to go into the land of Israel. Well, he hits the rock and water comes forth, but he couldn't listen to God. He didn't listen to God. In his grief and his sadness, In his frustration, instead of doing what he was supposed to do, he lashed out in anger at that rock, and he's punished. On the other hand, after Aaron dies, the people don't move on immediately. What does it say in the text? They stayed with Aaron and they mourned for 30 days, shloshim. You might have heard that expression before. It's a time that we mourn after a loved one dies before we move on. But before we can go on, we have to grieve. We have to mourn. We have to love and support each other. We have to provide comfort in any way that we can. That's why the cantor and I went up to Highland Park High School when we were told there was a need for us. What else could we do but be present to people in their shock, in their grief, to walk the journey with them at this difficult time? The last people that the cantor and I talked to, a mother and her son, they said they got to the hospital and, as I said, the woman was saved, but their car is now stained with blood. And she said, I don't know how I can go on. I know I'm supposed to go back to work, but it's so hard. And I said, you need this time before you go on to grieve, to process, to deal with the trauma. If you go on too quickly, you'll end up like Moses. I didn't say that to her, but I'm saying it to you. Hitting the rock, doing things that are not healthy or helpful. But once we've taken that time, we need to join our hands and hearts together to gather all of our forces and fight like hell, because our lives depend on it. Amen. We rise together.